Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the third of our online assemblies. What is the role of democracy in social practice? Can all voices be heard? I'm Elizabeth Del Prete, Senior Curator at Projects, and I am a white woman with long curly brown hair, and I'm wearing a white top. I go by the pronouns of she, her. I'm really pleased that you're joining us for this event as part of the Constellations Assemblies, which is a series of free online events open for everyone to attend, who is active and or interested in the expanded field of public art. The program takes place between March and November 2022, and by the expanded field, we mean the work that happens at the intersection of contemporary art and culture, social practice, and the public realm. In the UK, while there are increasing opportunities for socially engaged work, particularly in urban development and regeneration programs, there are very few opportunities to develop sector-specific knowledge and skills. And to address this, a project has developed this program that is part of our wider Constellations Learning and Development program. We're delighted to be working in partnership with Flattime House, a partner with whom we've been collaborating for a number of years, and Liverpool Benio, who are a new partner this year. The program of 6 events explores lines of inquiry that we feel are most vital for the sector to pursue right now. And these include questions around how can art affect social change, sustainability, and how can we go beyond that? Issues relating to the memorial, and of course, the question of democratic decision-making that we're exploring today. If you haven't already done so, please do register for the other events in the program via our project's website. I am delighted that today's event will be moderated by Ulrika Flink, Artistic Director at Konsthall C, a leading force in the socially engaged art scene in Sweden. Ulrika also serves as a curator at large for Black Archive Sweden and Settings. Before I hand over to her, I would like to quickly run through some virtual housekeeping. So if you do experience any technical issues during the event, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to chat with our dedicated tech support. On the right of your screen, you will see our Slido bar, where you can post questions using the Q&A function for our speakers. Feel free to write your name when prompted, as Slido uses anonymous as its default. Please note that our chair and speakers will be only picking up questions from the Slido Q&A and not from the chat, from the Zoom chat function. So please do post your questions in the Q&A to ensure they get answered. We also have a British Sign Language interpretation available for this event. If you need a BSL interpreter, please message us in the chat and our text assistants will give you a dedicated access link. If you would like to access closed captions, please select the CC button at the bottom of your video conferencing screen to read along. And just to note that the event will be recorded today. I hope you enjoy the event today. Thank you for joining us. And I'm now going to hand over to Ulrika, who is going to kick off the event.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction, Elizabeth, and for inviting me to this program. So today's event, what is the role of democracy in social practice? So I think that I would start with telling you a little bit about my background. But first off, my name is Ulrika Flink and I'm a Black woman. And I'm wearing a blue shirt, blue and white stripes with black dots. I have short afro hair and yeah, I'm sitting in an office in Paris with a white wall behind me. So yeah. So to start off, I would like to remind everyone who's listening in that we welcome you all to participate. So that's how you do that is go to Slido and you can put your questions in the Q&A section and we will look at those questions when we get to the discussion part. So I'm briefly gonna introduce myself, and then by sharing some images for where I work. And then I'm also gonna introduce our two guests, which is Adam, James, and Magda Fabianczyk, who will then talk for about 10 minutes each, talking about their own practices. So let me see if I can share the screen here. Okay, so as Elizabeth said, I work in Stockholm at Konsthall C. And Konsthall C is an institution that's been around since 2004. And we are located in a public washroom. And this, laundry space, and this has been a laundry space since 1949 when it was built. And the really interesting thing is that on where we have our 3 rooms where we show contemporary art and also house archive of the specific location of Hökaringen, which is a small borough in Stockholm. And on the other side of the wall, there's an active laundry space for all the community. So we have sort of a built-in engagement with the community by sharing the space of the laundry room. We engage, as Elizabeth said, in different types of exhibition making, but also very much sort of digging where we stand, making projects with Hökaringen as the subject and the people who live there. One of our main objects is to be a leading partner in Sweden for socially engaged practices, but also looking at curatorial thinking and artistic experimentation. So my own program, here we see more images of Hökaringen. My own program is centered around the notion of listening and being in a relation, searching for new forms of collectivity that are determined and or defined by the depth of relationships and shared longing. The program investigates through voice and language, i.e. the ability to speak and the ability to formulate oneself in relationship to others and one's own rights. A voice is both individual, but it's also, of course, collective in its essence. No voice is heard alone, but appears as a stream in a sea of other interwoven voices. The ability to see someone in oneself, and based on this insight, speak and act in the world, is one of life's moral pillars. And this we are trying to reflect in our different projects. And of course, that is inspired by poet and philosopher Edouard Glissant. Embedded in the program is a rich and rigorous thinking process around what it means to work with art, what it means to work in relationship to others, and what it means for art to be part of a democracy. And I'm really happy to speak further on these issues together with our 2 panelists this afternoon. But before that, I would like you all to maybe check out the poll that you can see in slide. The question there is, can art and the making of art make a difference and strengthen democracy in realization of a more interconnected civil society? And you have yes, no, or maybe as the 3 options. We will return back to this question at the Q&A, but I guess the very belief in art is one of the it's one of the things that are is sort of giving me power to continue working in sometimes difficult circumstances. And a lot of you who are turning today to listen to this has also perhaps shared this core belief. So I'm going to stop sharing and we'll go to the introduction of Adam James. So first of all, I'm gonna read Adam's bio. So let me introduce him. Adam is born 1978. He's a British artist. At the heart of his practice is the desire to bring people together in order to understand the self and to open up new ways of being and interacting. He uses non-verbal play to encourage forms of dialogue, meditation, and the reconsideration of sameness and difference. James makes sculptural objects, drawings, photographs, videos, and texts that all arise from his steadfast involvement in the performative practice of live action role play called LARP, which we will hear more of. James' focus is on the experimental style of Nordic LARP, which we will, of course, also hear more of. James positions the LARP as a tool to trigger, on a micro level, future possibilities, new forms of collaborative democracy, and the temporary dismantle of hierarchies. So welcome to welcome to Adam. Our second speaker today is Magda Fabianczyk, and she is an international recognized multidisciplinary artist and activist and educator, and the co-founder of the Polish Migrants Organise for Change, POMOC. Her work focuses on art and politics, combining narrative meditation, co-creation, and placemaking to open up spaces for direct communication between those who could not otherwise meet. She taught fine art and experience design at UAL Central St. Martin's and is founding member of, and I'm sorry if I'm saying this wrong, but Disivouch London, a UK Polish women rights group. Magda will help me there. Magda has also worked with institutions such as South Bank Centre, the Kochi Biennial, and Commissions for Camden Alive and Islington Council, among others. And I'm super happy to be in dialogue with both of them. And first off, we're going to ask Adam to talk for approximately 10 minutes and share some images of his practice. So the floor is yours, Adam.
Thanks very much. Yeah, thanks very much for the nice introduction. I should just make sure that my screen is being shared. I think currently, Ulrika, your screen is still being shared, but I'm going to just share a presentation I've got here. And let's go to this and view slideshow. Hopefully you can all see this okay. Yeah, so I guess just to talk a bit about my practice very briefly. It was really, it's always weird to hear your bios back. I feel like they're always changing as time moves on. But yeah, I work with LARP, live action role play, I guess, as a sort of methodology. Quite accidentally, really. I kind of just stumbled across it as a kind of a more nuanced, I guess, and kind of interesting tool set for kind of bringing people together through play. So now I have a practice, I suppose, where I'm either making LARPs or I'm making environments and objects and scripts related to LARP as a means to bring people together. And so it's, yeah, I don't know what to think about whether or not I have a socially engaged practice, but I work with people. So I suppose I do, whether I think about it in that way or not. But I wanted to show and share two projects which felt relevant to this. The first one I wanted to share is this one, which was a project in England, Kent, with Turner Contemporary, which was a project called Art Inspiring Change. So I'll just share some images from that. And then I'm going to try and share some images from a more recent project, which I did with Tate, St. Ives Commission, which was called Kemeneth, which is Cornish for community. So the project here in Turner Contemporary, we were selected, as you can see here, by the children from 4 different schools, which was in itself a kind of really interesting beginning to this project. They interviewed us and decided who was sort of the fun person they would want to work with their school. I was very lucky that I kind of connected with some kids from one of the schools, and over an 18-month period, I worked with them. I think probably the fact that I used role play and play in my work kind of struck a chord with the kids. And the project was one where the broad kind of mission was to try and use a children-led art project in Margate to kind of help regenerate parts of the area, the town, and to kind of instigate change from a kind of children-led perspective. So I worked with this school where art had been completely cut from the curriculum, actually, and it was, you know, they had like images of the royal family in pasta shells on the wall as you came in the school. That was the extent of their art classes. And so I dropped in there, and we started using LARP as a way to kind of encourage the children to kind of think about putting themselves in the position of others. And this great image here you can see is quite far into the project, where half of the group are role-playing the board members of the Thanet District Council, who are predominantly UKIP and a Conservative council at that point. And the other half of the group were pitching a proposal for a public artwork to the council. And we did this as a way to kind of like test the water for them in advance of us knowing that they actually would end up in the council presenting the idea for their public artwork. So it's partly to kind of stress test the kids, but also to kind of put them in a position where they could be the voice of no, and then kind of come back from that position with a kind of more empathetic understanding perhaps of what it is to be the council members who might object to the plans for the public artwork. And they then, presented this in the council. And it was just like absolutely glorious to behold these kids just like taking everybody to town. And through this project, we eventually ended up proposing a sort of regeneration of a totally underused woodland area. There's no sound on this video, by the way. We regenerated this old woodland and filled it full of sculptures. It was called the Walking Roller Coaster, and they invited children and members of the neighbourhood in Margate to come and take part in this kind of playful reimagining of this underused forest. And we had these 4 different schools involved in the project, and I was working with the this school in Tivoli Woods. It was great actually, because I lived next door to the school as well. So before and after the project and throughout it, I would see all these children every day on the way to school and on the way to work. And this was a map of the work we did, and some images of the final thing we made in the forest. And what you can see here is children who are making bird sculptures out of plasticine, which they put on sticks. And then we had a kind of procession of these birds through the town, which everybody joined, and it ended up at Turner Contemporary. So that kind of brings me to another coastal project, which I guess is a bit of a theme, I guess. In a way, I kind of think that I've ended up with a practice, maybe a social practice, as a sort of accidental byproduct of working with role play. I think there's a lot of mutual kind of shared aims, really. I suppose I always approached my work in the beginning with an idea to kind of create an image or a film which documented some kind of human play, role play with people pretending to be characters. And in the beginning, I just did that very clumsily. I didn't really know how best to do that. And over time, and then discovering LARP, I realized a much kind of better tool set for kind of helping people enter into a kind of more co-creative, co-authored space. And a lot of those kind of outcomes from that, feelings of kind of transformational growth, perhaps, to be grand, or just, trying new things and trying to put yourself in the shoes of others, had a very kind of sympathetic relationship to the kind of aims, often the goals of these kind of socially engaged outreach projects. So it kind of, the two things sort of fell in line with each other rather accidentally. So it just sort of started to happen that I was invited to work with specific groups in an area. And in this case, I was invited by Tate St. Ives to work specifically with a community in St. Ives, and this is during lockdown. And so these images you can see here are some of this, I do a lot of digital painting, and so we use these digital images as a kind of score with which we would play in digitally remotely, because this project was done during, as I say, lockdown. Kameneth project. And the goal of this project was to try and bring people together during lockdown, during a time of isolation, through some new means. Had COVID not been the case, I would have been in England playing with them physically. But as it was, we used a lot of new technology that I hadn't used before, so spatial chat. So what you can see here, this is like a drawing, but people could move around this image and talk with one another. And then we made a series of other kind of co-authored spaces, which were based on, there we go, ideas from the participants. I'm jumping ahead a little bit here by mistake. But we eventually led to us doing quite big and brave things, I think, for the people that took part in this. We worked with about 8 to 10 people from St. Ives. Most of them are not tech savvy at all. And we were always trying to kind of work towards the cultivation of a sort of new type of space where there was a kind of flat hierarchy and everybody's voice kind of mattered. And again, that's very sympathetic with, I suppose, how we work in LARP. Let me just jump forwards. Eventually that led to the creation of a more kind of developed virtual space, which the community in St. Ives played from the position of fictional characters they'd created. And through working with them over 4 months, we decided, or they sort of decided, we decided together to try and create 2 fictional communities which addressed real world needs for them as residents in St. Ives, who at the time felt excluded from communities they would normally hang around with, or friends or family. So they kind of created like a fictive solution to that, and then created a world where these fictive community groups could meet one another to sort of see what comes out of it. And what you can see here with these images is a workshop space that we, oh, hello, let me just go back to slideshow mode. So I tried to replicate, here we go, sorry, classic jumping around. My bad. What I wanted to do is to try and replicate something that I would do physically when I run a LARP. So we have a workshop space, and then we go off and we sort of play in an environment, whether it's in a building or outside, and we sort of replicated that digitally. So people run these simultaneous workshops where they became these characters. We taught them the controls, and eventually they met online as these 2 communities in these 2 separate islands, which kind of represented 2 parts of St. Ives, with sculptures and objects, which were things inspired by objects from their home. And eventually this kind of was also manifest in the gallery as physical versions of the digital avatars they'd created, and physical objects that were like my translations of things from their home. And we also made an augmented reality app. So we tried to kind of create various spaces which the extended public could meet in and kind of have a new way of being with one another through play in different kind of formats. So I probably should just jump out of that now and close that down and try to come back to this. I think hopefully that's kind of just in the nick of time. But yeah, that's me. So hopefully that there was some value in that and it wasn't too rambling. And I'll hand over now to Magda.
Yep. Thank you so much, Adam. Yes, Magda, please go ahead.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. And, can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. I'm just going to bring all of you here so I can also see you. If I speak too quickly, which is my tendency, please let me know, and then I will slow down for the interpreters. So I'm Magda, I'm a white woman with sort of semi-length dark blonde hair. And I'm in a white room, which looks like an office, in a kind of t-shirt that resemble sea waves. I hope it gives some kind of idea. So my work explores relationship between art and politics. And in 2019, I co-founded, together with Marzena Żukowska, migrants' rights organization called Polish Migrants Organise for Change. And we are also known as POMOC. So we are predominantly organizing the very large Polish community in the UK. it's around 900,000 people, but we do it in solidarity with other migrants and communities. And many of our projects is developed through partnerships and co-creation. And among things like direct support, campaigning, or political education, a core part of our work are the sort of leadership support stipends, where we offer funding to people that would like to basically develop their ideas. And all this work is very much towards creating some kind of shift in the power dynamics that we observe around, and also in seeing more migrants in the position of leadership. And I think that very much links to my practice. So I sort of moved away a little bit over the last 2 years from working on strictly art projects, because I was setting up the organization, but we are now looking to bring more of that kind of inclusive art practices into our space as well. And so I really believe that co-creation, if genuine and well-planned, leads us towards new possibilities, and these unexpected outcomes are sorts of treasures that we would never come up individually, and they offer those kind of prototypes for different models of societies, or different workplaces, or different art institutions, or in a way here, I mean, on this slide, I have democracy as an unfinished project that requires constant reevaluation and reimagining. And I really believe that democracy is this kind of ongoing and incomplete project that needs this kind of constant reimagining. And I suppose that co-creation makes this process more fair and more inclusive. And art can be this kind of playful environment that offers opportunities for people to practice democratizing in their own spaces. So here, one of these images is actually, it's an event from a series of edible intervention and series of democratic soup. And it happened at Studio Voltaire, and it was in partnership with Eastern European Resource Center and Art Collective. They are here. And democratic soup is based on this sort of premise that each attendee brings an ingredient for a collective negotiation of what goes in a dish. And this becomes a kind of metaphorical starting point for a discussion around notions of democracy present in the work the way we live, the way we work, how we organize our life, how we build relationships with other people. And collective cooking as well becomes this kind of a way to connect, negotiate, and attempt to reimagine a different democratic ideal in a way. And I organized it several times in different settings, and each time participants' contributions started with small provocations, sort of firm statements and negotiations. But as we moved forward in our cooking activity and people began to actually feel hungry, we moved towards exploring compromise and practical solutions. So at the end, we had something to eat. And the other image here is from a project with the Roma community in Poland, Unbelievable Things. And this was an 8-year process with the Roma community in Polish city Bytom. And this is a very post-industrial city with, I would say, third or fourth now generation of unemployment. So when Poland moved from the communist from the kind of communist regime towards democracy and embraced this very sort of capitalist model imported from the United States, we kind of saw a lot of those areas that were thriving, collapsing, industry collapsing, but also communities sort of being disconnected disconnected from, for example, the city centers, or from opportunities, or from and we kind of saw very much in this particular city as well across the years very bad politic of the local authority towards the Roma community. So there is a lot of I mean, as we can see as well in the UK, migrants are often blamed for problems with NHS or unemployment. So the same over there, we could see that Roma community was blamed for quite a lot of issues, such as, for example, other people not being able to get work and so on. And also it was perceived as this kind of very hermetic group that was very difficult to access. I got a prompt that I should move on. So maybe I move to another image, which this is from one of the projects with the Roma community, and as a migrant in the UK, I work predominantly in this context of migration with groups of individuals that find themselves in minority, often discriminated against. So the aim of many of these projects is, like I said, is shifting the existing power dynamics to kind of on a sort of multiple levels, and making gallery a more accessible space for people so they can use it as a free resource, and also to organize and strengthen their power. And in that process, it's really important to acknowledge the creative potential of all those people that come into the project as participants. So I don't want to make work about certain groups of people, but actually with them. And a lot of decision making is shared. So this is a project from the series of Unbelievable Things from the same exhibition. And we actually use this kind of idea of Joseph Beuys' public lectures. We work with children from that area of Bytom whose parents were really struggling economically, and the children themselves sort of didn't have access to many of the resources that, for example, someone in a different city in Poland would have. And we've looked at the idea on the kind of let me move to this just to show you. So we've worked with this idea of a game, Snake and Ladders, and we looked at how we can actually achieve aim and what might be the barriers to achieving a kind of goal, or achieving, what our desires are and how we might get there. And things emerge, such as, for example, well, actually our there is racism here, there is an issue with homophobia, there is an issue with discrimination. So we would unpack it collectively with children, and then they would decide on specific elements and specific rules for the game, so other people could play it later. And moving back to where I was, some of the ideas as well behind my work are associative democracy. So how we kind of decentralize the processes, this sort of idea of artists as an uninvited guest, and looking at others as adversaries rather than enemies. I mean, obviously, in certain spaces when we work with figures like Priti Patel, I don't think we can hope for her to be our adversary. But for example, local authorities in Poland, there are people out there that we might bring in and start these conversations. And this is a project in Poland with the Roma community. Again, this was actually the first collaboration where we created a meeting between the representatives of the Roma community and the representatives of the local authorities in Poland. And we used gallery space as this sort of space, a safer environment for this conversation to happen, because Roma never ever had a chance to sit around the round table with people who were actually holding power in that area. And we've invited representatives from the city council, but as well police and the local church. And the discussion was led by Roma representatives. This was actually the project, this work where I was not, is actually something completely different that I had planned when I went to Bytom, but I spent 1 year over there discussing the Roma situation with Angela Mirga, local Roma activist, and entering the community with her. And we decided that actually, rather than making a film, which was my idea initially, we would create an event that would be a closed event with no public, but where Roma would have this kind of possibility to sit around the round table, which is quite symbolic in Poland, if you know a little bit about the solidarity movement as well, to sit around the round table and have and direct that conversation. And it started with the words of Angela, I would like to enter those areas where I've never been, which meant that she couldn't, for example, go to a shop and feel safe. She couldn't go to a local discotheque, or she couldn't enter a football stadium, because these spaces were really dangerous for her. And she was actually told by police when she went there, or bodyguards, it's better if you don't come in because it's unsafe. So we've kind of looked at, worked with the local authorities during this discussion to try to sort of understand, why this is happening and how can we work to change that. And what oh, is this the end? Okay, so I'm just going to move to the very last slide, if that's okay. And this is just a quick call for solidarity. So at the moment, as you might know, a lot of institutions in Poland, art institutions, are being taken over by the far right. So the directors are being replaced by people that are the servant of the current government, which is very racist, homophobic, very misogynist in its policies. And I think that there is this kind of warning for us here in the UK to really think about where we're heading. And I think there is space in the art world for more collaborations with movements and activists that are operating on the fringes or beyond the art world. And I think that also kind of starts with looking at ourselves and thinking about, you know, the very kind of problematic notions of success, of a competition that are embedded in how the funding is structured and how we kind of are all the time put in the position of competing with one another. So that's just a quick presentation from me, and I'm sorry I overrun.
Thank you so much, Magda, for your presentation. And I think that we could move on to the sort of discussion part now. And I would like to remind you all about how you ask questions. So in the Slido, you have a Q&A part, and that's where you put your questions that we then later on will talk about at the end of this discussion part. So thank you so much, both Adam and Magda. And it's great to see the difference between your practices, because I think that, gives us the idea of the width of social practice also. But I would perhaps also like to ask you guys the poll that we've been asking everyone who's taking part of this event. And the poll question was, can art and the making of art make a difference and strengthen democracy in the realization of a more interconnected civil society? The three different options was yes, no, maybe. Right now, I would say that yes is leading quite, a large, it's 75%, no, 76 actually % of you who say yes to that question. But Magda and Adam, what would you say to this question?
Yes.
Yes,
I think it can. Well, I'm wondering whether the question is, not can it, but do we want it? Is it the hope? I don't know if it. So I would like it to. I don't know if it's happening yet, or it is on a small scale, perhaps. But yeah, I don't know. Magda, what do you think?
So the question is, can art and the making of art make a difference and strengthen democracy realization, right?
Yeah.
Am I on the right question? Yes.
You are.
I think it very much. I think there is very much potential in art to do this. I think it still happens not as often as it should. And I think there are also, one of the problems is that as artists, we operate in a very fragmented way. So, and I think that there is a need for more solidarity and more cooperation with social movements. And I think there is a lot of inspiration as well in social movements to take from and import in the art world. For example, looking at the women's strike in Poland and how they operated on a very decentralized way and how they managed to activate enormous amount of, hundreds of thousands of women across Poland, even in a small city, and politicize their voices. And that kind of never happened before. It didn't happen since a solidarity protest in like 1980s in Poland. So, I think that art also has that potential. You can see like Migrants in Culture, working with Migrants Organise, and how this kind of collaboration is then, motivating, mobilizing, communities against the hostile environment. We've also worked with art as well as a kind of way of bringing people closer to the voting processes, to kind of encourage participation in the electoral systems. And but I think there is also a need to as well invest in invest in migrant leadership in the arts. and see that as well, sort of, you know, at the kind of decision making positions within the institutions.
Yeah, I mean, that's really important, and it sort of also goes back to the question of how art projects actually starts. So if we look at your projects, you know, Adam, you were selected by children, which is an interesting and rare sort of start of a project, but very embedded. But more generally, how do you navigate your own ideas and starting points of an art project in which, you know, sort of, is it in tune with certain questions in that has to do with community needs, or is it a wish to work with a certain topic? How do you start off your projects? That's my question. Maybe you want to start, Adam.
Yeah, I think it's kind of, as I say, it's become a sort of byproduct, really. Before I was being in the fortunate position I'm in now, where I'm commissioned or approached to work with specific communities. Like, for example, the Tate project. Before that, I would build and kind of create the context myself. And it was more that I was, I guess I was motivated by, yeah, environments and site-specific kind of performance I would want to make with, in the beginning, I guess, whoever sort of would want to take part. I didn't really make those early works that are funded by the Arts Council with target audiences in mind. I found that was always a bit of a prickly subject, really. Like, you know, who is this for? And you know, if I'm targeting any group or groups, there's always the risk of excluding others. So I just kind of made them in the knowledge that whoever would hear about it through the normal kind of paths would come to that, which invariably is, you know, predominantly white middle class people of a certain age in the UK. And I carried along that path for a while, and then kind of not giving so much thought about the impact or the kind of ripples out from those works afterwards. But I did start to kind of notice that what was happening, the more interesting thing that was happening was kind of in the minds and in the bodies of either the performers or the kind of people that are more directly engaged with the work rather than the sort of secondary audiences. So I started to think about that notion of, you know, what the audience is and how we kind of, is that necessary? Do we need an audience? And how do we represent, I guess, kind of more social works? I mean, I think there's a kind of, I've got to pick my words carefully, but maybe a bit of a easy tendency to kind of make social projects and then show the kind of detritus of that as the work, which tends to be like, you know, physical remnants or pictures of people doing stuff, which is, you know, important that we capture that stuff. But for me, that always felt like it fell very short of what the work, where the work actually was. And then more recently, that work led, you know, that working in that way led me to be approached by institutions like Tate and Wellcome Collection and the Serpentine Gallery, who I guess could see perhaps the thing that I was taking for granted, but not seeing, it wasn't really seeing in a way, because I wasn't so guided by that, but they could just see that this way of engaging people through play and putting making the kind of the participants be the kind of co-authors of the work has a very mutually kind of beneficial outcome. And so now I'm kind of like led to make works with groups in a way, often doing what I was finding quite challenging perhaps to do in the first place, which is to work specifically with a kind of group. So it's like a series of happy accidents, I would say, and I continue to be motivated by or see these as opportunities to like come back to trying to answer this question, which is very like embedded in, I guess, me trying to have a deeper and more empathetic understanding of the other and how I bring myself closer to the other, whatever that other group or individual might be. And for me, role play is a very effective way of doing that. And so I see each of these projects as a kind of new way of trying to answer that question, really. So yeah, that's my thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. How about you, Magda? How do you sort of approach the starting point of your projects, and how does that connect back to the wishes of a community or participants, and sort of a shared idea of what the outcome would be?
So it starts with a long period of research usually. And I spent, for example, in terms of Roma community, I spent 1 year before we actually came up with the idea of what we're going to do, just having conversations and understanding what are the kind of needs of the local community, but also what are the desires and what the kind of creative elements that people that people can bring with them into that space. And I think that what's quite important as well is to, I mean, why this is important as well is because in order for people to participate, they need to feel that this is relevant for them, and they need to sort of feel emotionally connected with that process. And I think that goes as well then later with the audiences. I guess for me, the participant is always is also the audience, and it's the kind of primary audience very often. So so it's this kind of idea of, I guess Augusto Boal, spec actor, the one that watches, but also that shapes that process. So I would say research, and there is lots of elements like in experience design, which is kind of borrowed from very commercial very commercial space, but I think it's useful to kind of look into this as well. There are those kind of empathy mapping that one can do with the community. There are those kind of emotional journeys models that we can threshold engagement models that we can use as artists, and I think that they are useful, but they are useful as long as we do it together with the participants. So we kind of avoid imagining, who people are. And I think this idea of I think it's very important to remember that each of these people, they have incredible knowledge and expertise and creative potential, and they bring that into the project. So I think when I think about how I make art or what I'm going to make, I kind of think, how do I connect those dots so it comes as an artwork? How can I kind of build on this, and then somehow the idea for what we're going to do emerges from that.
Thank you. Yeah, and one thing that I mean lately have been thinking about is failure, and that connected to a couple of projects that I've been involved with, where community-based or participant-based, where you have different ideas about the outcome, and you sort of fail to put in or establish a mutual and lasting trust and shared goals, and how you, in the project itself, you have to rethink your method, and that becomes very of course hard, but also that's where you really learn to sort of tend to your own methods, I guess. So I would like to ask you both about failure and what you learned from it, if you had a case where you found yourself in a situation where you had to sort of let go of certain strategies, goals, or ideas within a project. Do you want to start, Adam?
Why not? So many. We touched on this the other day, thinking about this talk, and there's a litany of failures, I suppose, but how there where the good stuff is. And I hadn't thought of this one until just now, actually. And I guess it's like very seminal as an experience for me. Before I was really doing it, I was still at college. In fact, I was at the Royal College, and I was on a residency. Well, I think I just graduated and had gone back to Paris to do a residency. They have a studio there, and this was in the kind of early beginnings of me trying to kind of tackle and get my head around this, like wanting to make a kind of work that put me in the position of the other somehow. As a kind of by proxy way of me trying to get closer to my absent dad, who I'd never met. Perhaps all of this work stems from that, by the way. Anyway, and I was in Paris, and I was doing a lot of I was like, it sounds really creepy. I was stalking kind of like the kind of most Charlie Chaplin like tramps that you could kind of find, and Paris is riddled with, sadly, I'm talking about, these are real people, of course, with its tragedy that these people end up homeless and in these dire situations. But I was using a kind of comedy, kind of slapstick appropriation, I suppose, and becoming them through costume and dressing up as them. And I would start that process by studying them and then make films of me as them. And they were kind of silly work, but there was a kind of tragedy through that. Anyway, I there was this guy who he was just uniformly brown and greasy and filthy, and he was just the dirtiest, most stinkiest man ever, and poor guy. And he used to hang around outside my studio, this lovely apartment I had, and he would be rummaging around these bins, and I had this weird, terrible idea that I would he had these fantastic shoes where really there was not much shoe left. It was just his feet poking out of these shoes. And I had an idea that I would ask him for a shoe, or I'd replace his shoes with some new shoes. And then I would take his shoes and use them as the basis for a sculpture that I would embellish with diamante or something. I don't know what I was thinking. Anyway, and I decided that I would approach him about that. And I found I did this sort of a translation as best I could in French. And I went down and I met this guy and I said, hey, I'd love to buy you some shoes. In exchange, I'll have your shoes. I'll be back here in a week with some new shoes for you. And he was like, ugh, agreed, kind of thing. And anyway, a week passed, and I bought some shoes, and then I came back, and he was there a week later, and I came down with these shoes, and he just he rejected them and swore at me and threw them in the bin. And I left feeling really ashamed, and I had this moment of realization that what was motivating this idea in the very first place? So who is this for? Obviously it was for me, really, and not for this guy. And who was I to think that this person didn't still have an attachment to those things, or a degree of shame about it was just awful. Anyway, from that point on, it really made me think long and hard about who is this work for that I'm making, and where do I sit within this, and what's my offer, and and I suppose that's kind of been at the heart of. I try to, as much as possible, have integrity and be honest and lay myself bare now in everything else I do, and make it less about me as an artist and more about a thing that we make together. And I suppose it kind of stemmed from this very awkward, embarrassing kind of encounter with this sweet Parisian tramp. So there you go.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It is those hard sort of things that we remember and bring with us. So how about you, Magda? Do you have a failure that has been important for you in how you work?
I think many, and I think that it's nice you ask, because I think this is something that is rare. We don't talk about it enough. But I think maybe, without going too much into kind of details, I think the recent one, maybe from about a year ago, I worked on a project where I think I wanted to make it so collaborative that I was all the time sort of throwing ideas, and I sort of forgot why we do this. And the very kind of why, the reason for that was that the other person that I was collaborating with would feel stronger as an artist and would actually become more independent and sustainable. And I think at some point, when I realized that, it's not working as I would like, because I'm taking too much control in that process, and I just need to withdraw. And I just stepped back and took a role more of a sort of maybe a mentorship or a friend, but not necessarily someone that would then feel like this work that we've produced is mine. And I think the other one as well is from a project I've worked on with, again, a kind of community in Poland. It was a neighborhood where refugees from Chechnya were settled close to another community that was thrown out from social housing in the city and kind of put over there in the in a very kind of badly managed housing that didn't even have bathrooms. And there was a lot of tension because the kind of the building that where refugees were accommodated looked very nice from the outside. So the local community thought that this is like an amazing space and they have all this money and we have nothing. And I've worked for about a year or 2 years there to kind of bring more understanding and collaboration between the two groups. But also I realized that what I didn't do, and that was really important, was to actually work with an funding institution to create a kind of base and understanding why we do it together. And then when we had the final event, or like there was many final events, but the institution wanted to have this one final in its premises. It took a lot of work to bring that community there because they didn't feel, they feel intimidated by that space. And when they actually came, the photographer came to me and asked, you know, like they look really shy. Would you mind like doing something so it's a little bit like a cool image that we have for our press release? And it was this moment that kind of killed the project in a way, because I understood that, well, like there is a lack of understanding what the potential of this group here is. And if we don't have that, then we can't actually sustain this process when I leave. And that's what happened. You know, the process sort of faded away, and we came back to where we are before, where we were before. So so this is I think really important to kind of build that ground with all the stakeholders at the very beginning of a process, so we can build something that is actually meaningful.
Yes, and that, I mean, it's very often that we forget the afterlife of a participatory project. And that is, of course, many times on the shoulders of the institutions who are the commissioners, because there might not be money attached to follow up what happens with certain groups that has been formed from projects. But I know one thing that is done within the LARP community, Adam, is actually sort of you have methods and working models in place to think about the afterlife or what happens after a LARP, and to sort of bring all the participants in. Do you want to share that with us?
Yeah, I mean that's really one of the first things that really grabbed me about it as a kind of form. And this isn't true of all LARPs. I mean, LARPs are hugely varied, and they range from people running around in a forest dressed as orcs for days to like more kind of non-verbal abstract things in a small room. But nonetheless, a thing that's kind of often current within the Scandinavian kind of model is they give a lot of thought and attention to this like post-play care. And this really struck me for a whole bunch of reasons. But the simplest form that they do is they're really tight on there being a kind of debrief after a play, which in its simplest form is like a runda, where people sit around in a circle and we have a minute to express our feelings about what that play was like, that LARP was like. And that's a kind of non-hierarchical space where the authors and the designers always speak last. You have the right not to speak if you wish, and you know you can speak without being interrupted. And one, as a sort of a bit of a side, but it struck me that that's like a, you know, the play or the LARP or the experience of the art or kind of the cinema or the theatre, wherever it is, there's a kind of rarefied moment of like shared knowledge at that point at the end. And this is a really simple way of just like collectively delving into that rather than all sort of dispersing off. So that one thing I felt was really wonderful. But then following on from that, they have a kind of, the first thing they really applaud it and is great, and I think it's a wonderful thing, and it sounds maybe throwaway, but it's just to have like a party afterwards with everybody present. And again, part of the motivation for that is to like level kind of hierarchies between everybody, to kind of shake off any kind of roles or baggage that's been accrued through the play or, you know, whatever the activity is, and to kind of, you know, say goodbye to that. And then another thing they do, which is really nice, is a kind of like buddy system. And this really has emerged as a method to, out of a need, I guess, to kind of answer that some of the LARPs often are about very hard subjects, and a lot of the kind of understanding or unraveling or reflection can happen after the LARP itself. You know, I played in a LARP where I met my now current partner in England, where we were role playing the gay community in the 80s, and we were living through the AIDS crisis. I think, why would you want to play that? But it was a very beautiful, profound play over a number of days, but it really hit home afterwards. And so the buddy system that they use is a way where the organizers will often have a kind of Facebook groups or some kind of online social space where the people who played in characters can meet and talk and check in and see how they're doing afterwards. How is it unraveling? Is there a kind of bleed into or out of their real life from the perspective of the characters? And also that can also take the form of just like phone calls and chatting with people. So it's this kind of prolonged kind of period of care and checking in with one another, making sure we're okay. And it doesn't have to be a heavy burden or a big expense. It can be something quite light touch, I think. But I think that's really valuable as a tool or a way of thinking about this after how we deal with it afterwards.
Yeah, definitely. And in many projects, you do run into, participants and co-creators many years later who had profound experiences, and that only sort of they only sort of understood that maybe half a year later or so. So I do believe in thinking more about the aftercare, afterlife of these projects. We do have a question now in our Slido. So here it goes. Do we need to move beyond the narrowly defined constraint of the visual art infrastructure to achieve more inclusive, productive, democratic processes? And if we do, what do we lose? What do you think about that, Magda? Did you hear it?
Yes. Well, I kind of thought, when I thought about, inclusive and productive democratic processes, I immediately thought about the access to funding. That actually, for example, the Arts Council England funding is so bloody difficult to apply for. And it's something that, who can go through this application? Even the kind of COVID support fund, the SOLSYN, this Solidarity Syndicate, that was a collective kind of process of different artists and activists. It sort of it provided that kind of support to one another. So, for example, if there is someone that doesn't know how to write well in English, but still an artist here in the UK, then we wrote that application for them. Or, for example, pool and writes several applications and then share the funding. So I think this kind of this sort of elements of disruption are within the art world are very much needed, and we can do it as artists individually. I think we have that kind of power if we organize. What we lose, I don't know. I guess it's you kind of you won't have that many superstars out there, in the art world, but that's okay. I'd rather, we have a kind of a stronger dark matter. I think it was it Cholette that writes that nicely about the kind of dark matter and how it sustains the few at the top. So I think, I would very much kind of, vote for kind of solidarity and those small actions that disrupt how things are done at the moment.
Yeah, thank you. Adam, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm just sort of mulling that over. I mean, I don't know, I always felt like this kind of public funding model, to sort of pick up on your point. Yeah, it's very hard to obtain, but I sort of felt that model of seeking funding for this kind of work automatically kind of excluded a very large, it excludes so much of the kind of commercial art that people don't tend to get public funding for making paintings or sculptures. I mean, that kind of funding available tends to support projects that feel, broadly kind of more social. And I only say this with the knowledge of my previous partner was a painter, and I always felt it was how we both paid for our works to be made was very different, and the impact those works had, and how we measured that impact, and how the impact measurement process kind of through the Arts Council was this like onerous kind of reflection and evaluation, and the kind of evaluation process of the paintings in the gallery was, did they sell? I'm kind of going on a bit of a tangent and rambling, I recognize here, but like, I don't know. I feel very fortunate now. Now I live in Sweden as well, and it's become very stark to me, the difference, I suppose, with some of the way that the work I want to make is funded here, but versus how it was funded in England. Yeah, and I don't know. We pay higher taxes here, and I've kind of realized anyway for myself, whether I like it or not, that by and large, the larger sort of social projects that I would do with institutions would, I can't make a living on them. You know, it's impossible, really. I felt that I was providing kind of care or kind of social service through my work, which I'm very happy to do, but it felt like I was being paid in the same way as if I was literally a carer. So I've decided that actually I need to kind of embrace maybe not the narrow constraints of visual art, but I don't know, can I kind of have those same desired outcomes through more commercial kind of practice? Or perhaps I am selling things and I kind of am more in that world. And that really for me is a matter of survival, and if my work's to carry on being able to be made and I don't burn out. You know, I had a wonderful project with tape for the last 2 years and I was pretty close to burnout at the end of that. And so I probably haven't answered the question at all, but those are my rambling thoughts on that.
No, don't worry about it. You have touched upon one thing that I think both you and Magda share, and that is, you know, having the ability, like having the chance to work into different countries and to very different contexts. Do you want to say something about that, Magda, in connection to how participant and co-authored practice is seen, both from your experience in Poland and how that connects back to your work in the UK?
So the last project I've done in Poland was, I think, 2019. So that's a few years back. I think at that time it was already quite difficult to make, to touch certain problems that might not be that, or issues that might not be that comfortable for the local governments. For example, in Bytom, the gallery I work with, they constantly had issues with the local government. You know, they had, when they staged a film that was opening a discourse around abortion and the kind of, underground, they had a protest outside, you know, of their gallery and things like this. So I think it hasn't been easy. But now I think it's incredibly difficult for artists to do work, for example, around anti-racism, to do kind of, you know, to tackle institutional racism because of the government and how kind of how much control it starts to take over the cultural sector. In terms of, you know, in terms of sort of difference in practices, my own practices, I think I feel equally comfortable here and there, sort of neither totally, you know, I feel like I'm sort of in between. I think Katrin Boom calls it translocal, and I quite like it. I think that we are very kind of translocal as artists, and we are, you know, we have this ability to make home and embed in the kind of context and build on this. In various places.
Yeah, I mean, I mostly just practice in Sweden, so I don't see myself as translocal, but I am really interested in inviting colleagues from contexts that are perhaps a little bit more problematic to work within than Sweden. So sharing, organizing together, and learning is one of those things that I think is super important. We have a question from the audience, and I'm not 100% sure if I totally get it, but I will try. So it says, all the examples of failure brought it back to recognizing agendas, your own position and reasons for making the work, and the importance of empathy within this. So I really like this comment or question. I think perhaps it might more be a comment, but this idea of importance of empathy. How do you see empathy within your practice, Adam?
Yeah, it's I see it as a kind of, I hope that it's a sort of, as I say, like a sort of byproduct in some way. But so I tried to explore it kind of in a duality, that it's like a byproduct or something that we kind of experience through the play, and then to kind of reflect on what that felt like, or what, but then also as a I tried to kind of weave it into the fiction or the concept itself. So, and I sort of do that by setting up situations where, if we were to imagine the play has a kind of outcome, a desired outcome by me, although I never know purely what it's going to be, in order for that to be met or reached, there needs to be some kind of empathic process that people embark on. So it's a kind of goal and an ambition, I suppose, but often it fails disastrously, and that's fine. I think I'm kind of happy to be told often by the people that take part in my things that what they thought they were signing up to, or what they thought they would get as an experience, is often not what they've got at all. But yeah, I don't know. I hope in some sort of way that, like, playing or taking part in these works of mine there's a kind of process of like charging up the kind of players or the participants, sort of, and then unwinding them and letting them back loose out into society, and that in some way there's a kind of questioning of norms and questioning of hierarchies and power dynamics, which they kind of see through this kind of playing in a new position. And so I think it's like trying to kind of start a little empathic metronome ticking away or something, and to see what effect that has. I never know, because I don't then get to meet these people often afterwards, but yeah.
Yeah, and Magda, we're now, I see, running out of time a little bit, but I also would like you to maybe say a few words about empathy and your practice.
Okay, I'll be very quick. So I think for me, empathy is about actionable solidarity, and this element of action is really important. And I think it's also about recognizing that we exist within specific power dynamics, and that this power dynamics, such as, for example, let's say misogynism, racism, whatever that might be, that slips into the institutions and also into our own narratives. We're not kind of immune from this. We kind of constantly have to go through this process of anti-racism and so on and so on. And I think it's to recognize as well when to step away, when to give space to others, because as much as we struggle as artists, and we do, and it's a very difficult space to operate and to make living from. There are other artists that, for example, because of their background, they have even less opportunities. So it's about sharing, it's about organizing, it's about removing yourself once in a while.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that is a very good place to end on empathy, and also understanding of what it actually takes to set up a project where democracy can set up a project where the idea of working on democracy together can actually work in reality. And so today we've been looking at two very different practices, but I think that bringing together these ideas and notions around social practice and what it takes to find a common platform to make change happen is a complex and long-term engagement. But most of all, it's something that is needed more in the art world. And so I would like to thank both Adam and Magda for taking the time, and of course Elizabeth and everyone else involved in the team for spending these 1 hour and 15 minutes with us. Thank you very much, and I hope you will check out all the other great episodes of this series. So back to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Ulrika, and thank you, Adam and Magda. It was really great to hear about the tools and methodologies that you explore through your practices, how LARP uses empathy and helps us put ourselves in other people's position to inform decision making. And Magda, was great to hear about decentralized democracy as a tool to explore different power dynamics and enact them. Also thank you to the audience for participating and for the questions and the comments that you shared in the chat. Ulrika, you mentioned the upcoming events from this series. Do please sign up, and I very much hope to see you at the next Constellations Assembly. How can we move beyond sustainability? That will ask, how does the public art community move beyond the notion of sustainability towards a collective regenerative mindset? We will be announcing the lineup of speakers in the coming weeks via social media, so do sign up to our channels. And we will upload a recording of today's event on our YouTube channel, including captions. Yes, another huge thank you to our amazing speakers, to the Art Fund, the Arts Council, Barrington Hibbert Associates, the Constellations patrons and UP supporters for supporting the program, and to our partners, Flatham House and Liverpool Biennial, and of course to the Constellations programming team. Thank you so much, and hope to see you at the next one. Thank you all.